introduction, I will try and, I was just thinking, maybe, I'm not sure it's that impressive actually, but anyway, you're only as good as your last commission report really, and I hope the Ownership Commission is going to, and the report we're going to deliver, actually not end of the year, we're going to aim for January, mid-end January, depending on things that are so far imponderable. That's the date that you should all pencil into your diaries. For when we're trying to roll out this, what I hope will be the best effort yet at bringing together the various debates on, literature on, critiques on, what constitutes good ownership. And I mean, just some context. I mean, the Ownership Commission was set up by the outgoing government. Tessa Jowell set up the Ownership Commission. She was very focused actually on the cooperative and mutual sector, and the exam question that preoccupied her was to what extent those ownership structures could be adapted. You know all this without me saying it, but I'll say it nonetheless. Adapted for and deployed as part of a public service reform agenda. And she asked if I would chair it, and I said that I absolutely took that point, but I actually thought that you could only position a commission of this type within a much wider context about ownership. It had to try and answer the question, what constitutes good ownership across the diverse ways which ownership is expressed, from the PLC through the cooperative and mutual to actually the partnership and family firm. Were the commonalities about what constitutes good ownership across those ownership structures, and at the very least, let's gather together a group of people, men and women, who know something about each of those, and who will accept, I guess, as a starting point, that there is such a thing as good ownership, which is not thrown up spontaneously by the operation of markets. It needs to be asserted, and that Britain has too little of it, and that it should be expressed in as many diverse ownership forms as possible. And starting off with that, let's see if we can let's see if we can kind of tease out some strands and come up with some recommendations, not just for the cooperative and mutual sector, but actually for the PLC and the family firm. Because actually, the story of our times is the kind of rise and rise and rise of the public limited company, which has become overwhelmingly the dominant ownership form in which economic activity is expressed in Britain. You understand why that's happened, what its defects are, and to the extent it's crowded out other ownership forms. It's not just a question of incentivizing them, it's also a question of understanding what are the defects of the PLC and actually attacking those too. You can't do one without the other. That's very much my view, and it's shared by the other commission members. So I just think it's worthwhile spending a minute or two reflecting on ownership. And what it actually means. I mean, to own is to have something that belongs to you. You have autonomy over it. You can direct it. And it's obvious that ownership matters. And it matters to other people how those ownership rights are discharged. And actually, no community anywhere permits a completely libertarian, kind of unregulated approach to ownership because of the what economists call externalities. What I think in common English is probably the best word is neighbourliness. I mean, if you own a property, a house in a street, or how good a neighbour you are, and if you're a bad neighbour, matters enormously to the houses contiguous to your own, and actually to the entire street. Nobody in the street can be different to a bad owner. And it's similarly in corporate life. I think that this kind of tension between kind of hyper-libertarian approach to ownership and at the other extreme, kind of social or collective ownership. I mean, I would argue that in no community has a libertarian view of private property rights actually succeeded, because you don't deal with the externality neighbourliness question. But equally, I would argue that wholesale kind of socialisation of ownership in a systemic way and doesn't work over a sustained period of time, because what is collectively owned, nobody owns. And the truth of the matter is that good ownership has to sit between these two polarities, however you define it. And I think that the story of the last 30 years has been, we developed in the West, and it was a Western phenomena, the public limited company. But in the 1970s, two very important things happened. In response to the notion that actually it was the stagflationary decade meant that there was something wrong with and the lack of dynamism, entrepreneurialism, etc., of the corporation. These two things happened. One was the view that actually managers needed to be made to behave like owners, so they should pursue the maximization of shareholder value. And that with the decline of individual shareholding and the rise of institutional shareholding, because institutional shareholders could all take the view that actually didn't have to worry about what a company did, what its purpose was, or even how neighbourly it was, or you could take a highly transactional relationship with that company and only think in terms of the risk that you run. And so those two things have been the feature of the last 30 years. And I think that it has generated bad capitalism across the West. I don't know whether I'll do this yet on Saturday, but the kind of Own Wall Street brigade have asked me if I'll kind of stand with a kind of microphone, well, megaphone actually, and try and condense this kind of rather complicated talk into kind of 4 or 5 simple shouts on the steps of St. Paul's Cathedral. And I'm not sure I can manage, but I do think that we have watched any account of the rise of bad capitalism is incomplete without understanding the rise of this transactionally driven ownership, in which actually the only consideration was the maximization of shareholder value, and not the more kind of balanced scorecard approach that actually preceded it in the way managers managed corporations broadly between the 1930s and the 1970s. And I don't think it was because of the way companies were owned and directed that the West had the stagflationary 70s any more than I think it's, that was due to a whole cluster of other factors that were, and the misdiagnosis of what went wrong has left us with another huge crisis in the way capitalism is structured. So I think that if it was bad capitalism and bad ownership that got us into this crisis, what is the good ownership and good capitalism that will get us out of this crisis? One of the things we're going to do in the Commission document is going to go through in quite painstaking way the various ways in which the rise of the PLC has actually crowded out, demutualized. When building societies demutualized, of course they took the PLC, they structured themselves as PLCs. When the utilities were privatized and the great nationalized industries were privatized, they were structured as PLCs, not as mutuals or as cooperatives. And the rise of the PLC has crowded out other ownership structures. And even where private ownership has tried to assert itself, like in private equity, it actually has a symbiotic relationship with the PLC and this highly transactional kind of ownership structure that's developed, because you try and fix the company that you temporarily own privately before you refloat it as a PLC. Some years later, what Ed Miliband has called predator capitalism, and what a pity it was that he could only really mention Southern Cross as an example of this, and as a good example of good capitalism, Rolls-Royce. And I think if you're going to make a speech of that type, and I've said this to him personally, you've got to have many more examples of good and bad, and actually think through this with a great deal more depth than was done in that speech. Although I do think the basic point of the speech and what Miliband and indeed Vince Cable is moving towards. Vince Cable has appointed John Kay, the economist John Kay, and the former chief executive of Rolls-Royce, Sir John Rose, to look at a kind of subplot within the good ownership story, which is the extent to which the interaction of the PLC and the current financial markets lead to too much short-termism. And I'm keeping in close touch with John Kay. Our report on Ownership Commission will be published in January, and his assessment will follow through in July. And we're going to make sure that these two reports talk to each other and don't contradict each other, so that in the first 6 months of next year, for 7 months of next year, there will be the first serious initiatives by a British government in what constitutes good ownership and how it can be improved in Britain. I think it's a bit of a landmark moment, and of course it's a landmark moment for you at the Mutual's forum. 2012 is going to be a hell of an important year, and you need to have your ducks in a row about what you want from this debate. I think that on the Commission we have Roger Carr, who's the chair of Centrica and the president of the CBI, and who was of course the chair of Cadbury's when it was taken over by Kraft, where he said in public a number of very strong things about how easy it was to take over British companies. Peter Marks, who's the chief executive of the co-operative, is on it. And Charlie Mayhew, who's the executive chair of John Lewis, is on it, as well as the deputy senior partner number 2 at PwC, and a number of other, pretty heavy hitters in British business, and getting them to, and actually from the investment community, and getting to align around something is going to be very tricky. But I think that there is a sense that good ownership as a minimum builds on a long-standing tradition in British life of trusteeship, and that the way current company law and actually investment law is structured, that actually the only obligation upon a trustee of a pension fund or a director of a public company is actually maximisation of shareholder value or maximisation of the kind of one's fiduciary obligations, with absolutely zero obligation to do anything other than take note of in the 2006 Companies Act, is what it says, of other factors. It really doesn't express a kind of long-standing conception in British law of trusteeship to be expressed, and that'll be one area I'm sure that I know the Commission agrees on, where we'll try to push the boat out a bit. And that links to something else about ownership. If you own assets which belong to you, either as an autonomous individual or as a group, one of it gives you all kinds of privileges to own and direct, because ownership matters enormously. You do have trusteeship obligations to those assets and the people and the web of contracts that you own, but you also have a custodianship obligation and a neighbourliness obligation. And I think around trusteeship, custodianship and neighbourliness are 3 pillars on which one can start to build a conception of good ownership. And I think the economic case is very powerful as well. I want the report to reproduce the evidence, and we've got a team assembled. We're going to build on it over the next 3 months, and it's really going to demonstrate how those 3 pillars kind of lead to or are associated with higher levels of employee engagement, higher levels of innovation, and actually sustainable and high investment companies, which also take their neighbourliness obligations and the spillovers that they impose on other people much more seriously. And what I want the final report to do is to stream, in legal and corporate governance terms, how those 3 pillars impact on all the ownership structures we have in the UK. Your own, of course, but also the PLC and the family firm and the partnership. And I want to assess what the legal and corporate governance requirements might be that would actually allow those features to be better expressed than they are in British law at the minute. And importantly, to ensure there is at least tax neutrality towards good ownership. And there are, I think, one of the extraordinary biases in the British tax system is that equity is less favourably taxed than debt. And Ed Miliband got himself a lot of trouble when he said how stupid it was to think you could organise the tax system to favour innovative and productive enterprise and lean against predator enterprise. And he and none of his team seemed to be able to kind of had understood that actually the highly leveraged takeovers of companies like Boots, and now domiciled in Switzerland, or the high leveraged takeovers of Southern Cross with the results we all know, would have been impossible without debt interest being relievable against tax. And I think that being able to have balance sheet structures where actually where equity is at least on the same tax basis as debt is an important way in which good ownership can be not biased against. You'll have discussed this morning, and I guess you'll discuss later on today, what kinds of legal and regulatory and tax changes are required to enable cooperatives in particular to access external capital while still retaining their mission as cooperatives and reality as cooperatives. And that's something that we want to tackle very much. There's more to say, but I don't want to outstay my welcome. I think we do have some very kind of interesting new evidence to put in the public domain, and I think that I'm hoping the report will be, and I did a report for the government on pay in the public sector, top people's pay in the public sector, which has led, the governor's adopted it completely to my slight surprise, so that public sector companies will be publishing multiples of their top executive teams to their median earners, and will be asked to roll out my ideas on earn back, putting part of your base pay at risk if you're a senior manager in the public sector, and some of my ideas about how the senior salaries review body should develop have been adopted. And when I did New Life for Health back in the beginning of the last decade, 2001, I argued for a constitution for the National Health Service so that it was constitutionally entrenched in Britain that every user of the National Health Service should enjoy health services free at the point of use, and that, as you all know, after initially being panned by all 3 political parties, that passed into law in January of 2010. So I'm hoping that I can get a hat-trick with this one, and that the Ownership Commission, because in many respects, this is, top people's pay in the public sector and the constitutional entitlement to free health are not irrelevant things, but actually ownership is right at the heart of our economy and our society. I believe passionately that it was bad capitalism that has landed us in this crisis. No account of bad capitalism is complete with the way in which ownership has been understood and discharged. rankly badly, in my view. And no way out, in my view, is possible without constituting a better capitalism, of which a good ownership is absolutely fundamental. So thank you very much. Thank you.